Welcome back to Nightfalls, the bedtime story show of classic and original stories designed to guide you into a calm and peaceful sleep. I'm Geoffrey Newland, and tonight, join me by the fire for the story of a family's idyllic weekend in the Yorkshire seaside village of Robin Hood's Bay. The moon was low in the night sky, beaming brightly for all to see. It was so low that it seemed as though it might just touch the water's edge as the gushing waves ebbed and flowed against the cliffsides and up the cobblestoned road to the village. Streaks of white moonlight reflected off the water's surface, as if it were a mystical pathway across the sea, leading to the moon itself. The bay was dark, and the moon was the only thing lighting up the area, save for the warm lights from a few nearby houses. The moon was the only light guiding the water to the land. Jacob and his 4-year-old son Mason were sitting on the curb of a pavement higher up the hill, looking down at the tumultuous water moving back and forth. Little Mason held on to his cup of hot chocolate with cautious, mittened hands and gazed up at the water like he was mesmerized. The pair had nipped out of their family holiday cottage to come down to the bay, while Mason's mother, Molly, was putting his baby brother down to sleep for the night. Mason felt like a grown-up, joining his father out in the darkness. He was used to being at home getting ready for his own bed when it was dark like this, but with spring still yet to arrive, the nights grew dark early, and so his father had decided that it would be nice for them to experience the strong tides of Robin Hood's Bay together. Mason watched the approaching waves and asked his father curiously, "Will the sea come any closer?" Jacob shook his head and replied, "No, Mason, don't worry. The sea only comes as far as this little road here." Mason was satisfied with that answer, and Jacob noticed his son's shoulders relax and release the tension they had been storing. Mason took a sip of his hot chocolate and smacked his lips together in delight as he swallowed. Jacob looked out to the magnificent moon. It looked incredible. Perhaps it was more than a full moon this evening. Perhaps it was a supermoon, Jacob thought. "Did you know, Mason?" Jacob began, imparting another fun fact to his young son. "Did you know that the moon causes the sea's tide to change? The moon's gravitational pull generates the sea's tidal force. So the moon is, sort of, pulling the ocean's water towards it." Mason scrunched up his little face inquisitively, and Jacob could see the cogs turning in his young mind. Eventually, Mason asked, "So if the moon is pulling the water towards it, then why is the water not all floating up into the sky?" Jacob chuckled at Mason's innocent and observant question. "That's a good question," Jacob responded, thinking carefully of how he could explain it to his son with his own limited scientific knowledge. "I think that the water doesn't float up into the sky towards the moon because the Earth's gravity is a lot stronger, so it keeps the water firmly on the ground, just like us. But when the ocean water flows into the tide, It's like the moon is trying to guide it and pull it in some way. Mason turned back to the water and they sat in silence for a few minutes. Mason was likely thinking over what his father had told him and was trying to make sense of it, so Jacob left him to it. Sometimes he forgot how young his son was. He was so open and curious to learn about everything. That is the wonderful thing about being young. There is so much to learn about the world that everything is so intriguing. Grown-ups are like a fountain of knowledge that children long to tap into. It's only when you finally grow up that you realize that nobody really actually knows much in the grand scheme of things. Out of nowhere, Mason pointed out to sea and hollered, "I think I can see a pirate ship." Jacob squinted his eyes to look out into the darkness, but couldn't see anything. His son did have a vivid imagination, so he wondered if he had imagined he could see something in the shadows. "I don't see anything," said Jacob gently, not wanting to quash his son's imagination. "But did you know that many, many years ago, pirates did sail into these shores? Although they weren't really called pirates then, they were called smugglers." Mason listened to his father intently as he explained a part of the history of Robin Hood's Bay. In the 18th century, ships of smugglers would arrive on the shores of Robin Hood's Bay under the cover of night and enter the smugglers' tunnels that ran underneath the houses of the village. Through the maze of interconnected houses that made up the hillside village, they would maneuver smuggled goods to avoid paying heavy import taxes. It seemed that everybody in the village was in on the action, most likely urged on by the excellent profits that could be made from selling just a single parcel of tea. The smugglers were experts at maneuvering their way through the streets unnoticed, and of course, the regular high tides of the bay made it easier for smugglers' ships to get close to the land. Mason appeared very impressed by his father's tale and looked out to sea again, trying desperately to see if he could spot the pirate ship once more. "Maybe I just saw one of their ships," Mason cried excitedly. Jacob chuckled and explained that there hadn't been smuggler ships around these parts for over 100 years now. "Well, you don't know that for sure," Mason replied stubbornly. Jacob smiled at his son. He was right. Jacob didn't know that for sure. For all he knew, smugglers could still work in these parts to this day, although he highly doubted it. Once they had finished their hot chocolates, the wind became gustier, so they started to climb the cobbled streets back to their cottage. The streets were narrow and windy. Some of them only felt like they were an arm's width apart, and with so many terraced houses crammed close to each other, it was hard to differentiate one from the other in the darkness. Every house was made of the same beautiful brickwork, some of which had been painted, sporting brightly coloured front doors with hanging plants and pots of flowers around them. With night upon them, the cosy lights from inside of the houses guided their way through the dark streets. And as they passed, they could see people nestling down in front of their fires, enjoying dinner around their dining tables and playing board games in the middle of their carpets. Jacob always felt that nighttime was when you got the best glimpse into the lives of other people, seeing how they chose to spend their time at the end of a long, tiring workday. No matter how different people's occupations could be, Everyone seemed to enjoy the same simple pleasures when they came home at the end of the day and were left to their own devices. We're all the same, really. Eventually, they reached the front door to their holiday cottage. Jacob pulled out his key and placed it in the golden lock of the blue door. Then he turned to Mason, put his finger to his lips and whispered, "We must be quiet because your mother might still be trying to put little Jackson to sleep." They pushed open the front door and tiptoed their way into the house. The lights were low, and the warmth of the house instantly heated up Jacob and Mason's frozen noses and chilly fingers and toes. Jacob walked into the small living room and stood in front of the blazing fire. He ushered Mason over, and they both took off their gloves and held out their hands in front of the flames to warm up. Jacob rubbed his hands together to create friction, and, amusingly, Mason copied his action. Just as they were feeling warm enough again to take off their coats, they heard some delicate footsteps behind them. They turned around to see Molly standing in the doorway. She looked tired and was already wearing her pajamas. "Hi, honey." Jacob greeted her quietly. "Did you manage to get Jackson down to sleep all right?" Molly folded her arms and leant against the doorframe wearily, before softly replying, "Yes, he went down without a hitch. Can't believe it. He must have been exhausted." Jacob was relieved to hear that their 1-year-old had gone to sleep so easily. He was finally getting into an easier sleep routine after many long months of sleepless nights, and it was doing the world of good for both himself and Molly. Molly announced that she was feeling ready to head to bed herself. She wanted to embrace the opportunity of an early night in bed, since Jackson had gone to sleep so well. Jacob glanced at Mason and noticed him make a big yawn. The little mite had been walking around all afternoon. After a long car journey to their destination that morning, so Mason had done well to remain awake for so long. Mason wandered over to his mother and wrapped his little arms around one of her legs. He rested his face against her side and declared that he too was ready for bed. Molly giggled and took her eldest son by the hand. She took off his winter coat and then led him upstairs to his bedroom. This was the great thing about visiting such a sleepy little village as Robin Hood's Bay, Jacob thought. The sleepy lifestyle quickly rubs off on everyone, and we finally all get a chance to relax. Jacob listened to his family pottering around upstairs, preparing for sleep, but he wasn't quite ready to retreat to bed himself, just yet. He poured himself a nightcap and nestled himself down into the armchair by the fire. He'd only been to Robin Hood's Bay as a child, so it was hard to remember what it was like from his memories. Thankfully, when they had arrived in the seaside community, it was even better than he had remembered it to be. They were only visiting for the weekend, so even though the village wasn't big, it provided just enough time for them to do things with their young children, whilst leaving time in the weekend for rest. When they had booked the holiday cottage, they had dreamt of a lazy weekend full of beach walks, fish and chips meals, and lots of relaxing around the cottage. The cottage was quaint and idyllic. It was newly decorated but still kept a lot of the original features that were common amongst the centuries-old cottages of the village. There were exposed wooden beams supporting the ceilings and bedroom walls made of clean white paneling. There was a grand fireplace in the living room and a cute country-style kitchen at the back of the property. In their master bedroom, they had a beautiful 4-poster bed, along with a small fireplace, and Mason had an adorable blue and white themed room with 2 single beds inside. Mason had promptly declared upon arrival that he would switch between both beds during their stay, so that it was fair on them both. Jacob couldn't wait to curl up in the comfy 4-poster bed that evening, but he fancied a quiet moment downstairs beforehand. Happily seated in the soft cushions of the armchair, he laid back and closed his eyes. He focused on what he could hear: the crackling of the fire, the soft tapping of footsteps upstairs, the gentle clicking of the boiler, and at times he could sense movement from the house next door. He could easily see how smugglers managed to move their contraband through the houses of Robin Hood's Bay with ease. All the houses were almost on top of each other. Once upon a time, there had even been doors that interconnected the houses. That's how the likes of smuggled tea made their way through the houses and up the hill with ease. They never even had to see the outside world, so they were away from prying eyes that might disapprove. Next, he focused on what he could smell. The wafting aroma of his smoky whiskey and the burnt embers of the fire. He could even smell the leftovers of their dinner that evening cascading out from the kitchen. Soon the house fell silent, and all that was left was the sound of the fire dancing in the fireplace. Jacob placed his empty glass on the table by his side and enjoyed the peace. It seemed that a sleepy weekend away in Robin Hood's Bay was, indeed, just what he needed. Before he knew it, Jacob had retreated to bed and drifted off into a deep, contented sleep. The next day, Jacob came downstairs to find Molly sitting outside in the narrow street on the pale blue metal bench that faced their front door, with the sun on her face. She was cradling a cup of coffee in her hand, and she was dressed in a floaty white top and a pair of jeans. She had her long blonde hair down, and she glowed in the sunlight. Jacob thought she looked positively ethereal. "Good morning," he greeted her and placed a kiss on her cheek. "Did you sleep well?" She smiled contentedly and declared that she had had one of the best night's sleep she had had in over a year. She took a sip of her delicious coffee and took a deep inhale to savor the aroma of the coffee beans. Enjoying your morning coffee is so much better when you are drinking it simply for enjoyment, rather than using it as a crutch to get you through the day. Baby Jackson had slept through the night, and both Jacob and Molly felt like new people for it. They debated what to do with their day. The town of Whitby wasn't too far away and had lots to do, with its abbey on the hill and bustling seaside attractions. But when they started to think about it, what they honestly wanted to do was take the day as it came. They didn't want to hurry themselves, and they didn't fancy making any more car journeys. So instead, they decided to stay put right where they were. They took Mason and Jackson to the children's play area at the top of the village for a while. pushing them on the swings and guiding them down the slides. The children loved it, and since they were so refreshed from their perfect night's sleep, even Jacob and Molly had a good time. Next, they made the steep descent down the cobbled hillside, all the way down to the bay. Mason was amazed to see that the choppy waves that had been so far inland last night were now far away, leaving behind a sandy beach for them to walk across. Mason, with his bucket and spade, delighted in digging up the wet sand and building sandcastles. Meanwhile, Jacob introduced 1-year-old Jackson to the sea by dipping his tiny toes in the low, lapping waves on the shore. Jackson giggled with delight every time his toes were tickled by the water, and Jacob couldn't help but think it was the best sound in the world. After they had enjoyed the beach for an hour or so, they walked all the way back up to the top of the village for ice creams. Jacob was starting to see why it was so easy to long for your bed in Robin Hood's Bay. Just walking up and down the long, steep hill was enough to tire you out. They sat at a wooden table with benches at a cafe overlooking the sea. There was a fantastic view of the bay from the top of the hill, and they all happily ate their ice creams in silence as they admired it. After a few minutes, Mason informed his mother that he had spotted a pirate ship the previous night, so they had to keep a lookout for any more that could be in the area. The little adventurer sat next to the balcony railings with his ice cream and stared out to sea intently. Jackson had fallen asleep in his pushchair by the time they had reached the top of the hill, so, thankfully, they could eat their ice creams without having to share. That was one thing that he missed about the time before he'd had children. Jacob often joked that it was a time when he didn't have to always share his food. The sun had been shining brightly all day, but now, as 3 o'clock rolled around, they noticed some rain clouds on the horizon. They decided to head back to their cottage before the heavens opened. But, sure enough, just as soon as they had finished their ice creams and started their journey back to the cottage, the clouds burst, dropping thousands of droplets of cold winter rain over their heads. They all laughed delightedly as they dashed through the narrow, curving streets back to their cottage. Mason got there first and started banging on the bright blue front door, yelling, "Let us in! Let us in!" Jacob joined him by his side and reminded him that they had a key to open up. He quickly unlocked the door, and they all piled inside the hallway. They were all dripping wet and laughed at each other's soggy faces and dampened coats and shoes. "Let's change into some warmer clothes," Molly laughed, stripping off her raincoat before turning to help Mason. They all changed into fresh, comfy clothes and thick socks, and Jacob got the fire back up and running. Molly made herself and Jacob a pot of tea and a hot chocolate for Mason. Baby Jackson had woken up from all the commotion of the rain and was now blissfully crawling around the living room area, playing with anything he could get his little hands on. Jacob rummaged through the cupboard of the TV cabinet for something to entertain them all with on this soggy afternoon. He found an old DVD copy of The Sword and the Stone hidden at the back and slipped it into the DVD player. They all snuggled up next to each other on the sofa with a blanket over their laps and their cups of hot drinks in their hands. It was the perfect, cozy setup. As they watched the old film together, safe and warm in their little holiday cottage, Jacob and Molly caught each other's eye. They smiled at each other, contentedly, and Molly squeezed Jacob's hand appreciatively. It wasn't long before Mason and Jackson had fallen asleep between the two of them. Molly followed, not too long after. Jacob gazed at his sleepy little family fondly. He looked out of the window and watched the droplets of rain trickle down the window pane. He loved the sound of rain. He always found it so relaxing. With the sounds of the rain outside and the sizzling fire inside, it was no wonder that the family had drifted off so easily. It appeared that a relaxing weekend away had certainly been exactly what the whole family needed to appreciate simply being together, admiring the picturesque village and enjoying the elements. As Jacob looked out of the window and caught a glimpse of the waves in the bay, he felt that this moment couldn't be any more perfect. It was just him, his family who he loved so very much, and Robin Hood's Bay, far away from anyone else and their usual fast-paced life. Here, for a weekend, all was calm, sleepy, and perfect. And as he closed his eyes, did he just catch a glimpse of a pirate ship on the horizon?